Hi, you're listening to the Apologist Bookshelf, and I'm Gary Zacharias. Sure appreciate you listening today. I'm back for about a third look. I think it's going to be the third podcast on Culture of Doubt. The whole title is Truth in a Culture of Doubt by Kostenberger, Bach, and Chatraw. And Kostenberger is a senior research professor of the New Testament. Bach is a senior research professor of the New Testament studies at Dallas Theological Seminary. And then there's Chatraw is associate professor of theology and apologetics at Liberty. So the three of them got together to deal with what they call engaging skeptical challenges to the Bible. And we're sure seeing a lot of skeptical challenges these days, aren't we? So chapter 2 says, is the Bible full of irresolvable contradictions? And I'll tell you one thing I like about this book is at the beginning of each chapter, they explain what the claims are that they're going to go after. So here are the 5 claims. The New Testament authors have contradictory points of view on major issues. Number 2, attempts to reconcile different events in the New Testament are mistaken because trying to harmonize these things creates another account that's different from the ones that you're reading. Number 3, the Gospel's chronological differences are actual historical contradictions. Number 4, the Gospels are so different in detail that they've got to be called erroneous at numerous points. They can't be viewed as divinely inspired. And then number 5, the diversity of views that you get in the New Testament shows that Jesus was not considered to be God in any sense. Now, he eventually became divine for his followers before he began to be thought of as equal with God Almighty. All right, so those are the challenges out there. And so guess who they're going to refer to more than once? Bart Ehrman, sure. I like this. They said Ehrman regularly claims that the modern scholarly consensus, and those are in quotation marks, support his claims. And he says that what he believes, that's standard fare. He says, held by all my closest friends. He said they're widely accepted among New Testament scholars. He says they're widely taught in seminaries and divinity schools. But they said it's only by defining scholarship on his own terms and by excluding those that disagree with him that he can imply that, oh, everybody else agrees with me. One reviewer of Ehrman said this: he fails to mention that of all the ATS-accredited seminaries in the U.S., the top 10 largest seminaries are all evangelical. They represent thousands of students, hundreds of professors. If virtually all seminary professors agree with Ehrman, then who are these professors teaching at the 10 largest U.S. seminaries? Apparently, the only schools that count in Ehrman's analysis of modern seminaries are the ones that already agree with him. So this author says, it's not so difficult to prove your views are mainstream when you get to decide what is mainstream. And so the 3 authors say, with that kind of rhetoric, that kind of comment, what Ehrman's trying to do is intimidate an audience that doesn't really know a lot about what he's talking about. And because he keeps talking about this weight of the circle of scholarship, and his is the only real type of scholarship, but it says that doesn't really help when you're trying to deal with the evidence. So it said, the fact is, hundreds of reputable biblical scholars disagree, right? There's the key word. They disagree with Ehrman on key points. And they quote Ben Witherington, and I like his material. He said, the more I studied the Bible, the less I was prone to accuse the Bible of obvious historical errors and stupid mistakes. He says, to the contrary, I found the Bible rich, complex, varied, and helpful and truthful in dealing with precisely such life and death matters. He said, why exactly did studying the Bible at the same way at seminary and during doctoral work lead Bart Ehrman and myself to such different conclusions? In my case, my faith in the Bible was strengthened, but the opposite seems to have been the case with Bart. Yeah, and then Witherington ends by saying, some of this clearly has to do with presuppositions. Boy, that's exactly right. Presuppositions are the views that you bring before you start studying. So, for example, let's say in the area of science, if you believe there's no God, then what are you going to do with evolution? You're going to say, well, evolution had to come about on its own, and so you're going to work within that structure because you don't think there's a possibility of a God creating life. All right, so talking about Ehrman, back to Ehrman here. He says, if the New Testament is inspired, he said it would have to have been copied a certain way. You'd have to be just about absolutely certain about every reading and translation. And then the Bible should have books that say the same things in almost exactly the same way. And Ehrman says, well, the Bible didn't meet those expectations, so he walked away. He began to see diversity as contradictions. So they said, despite Ehrman, they said when you look at the New Testament documents, it said all of its diversity is unified around a cluster of central themes, and it culminates that story that's in the Old Testament about salvation coming for people. So these authors say it's been demonstrated there are at least three motifs that are in the major New Testament authors. Three, right? And in other words, these are the three main issues that the New Testament holds together. One, there's one God. Two, Jesus is the Messiah, an exalted Lord. And number three, the Christian community has been entrusted with the proclamation of the gospel. So we've got these three pillars, these authors say. So then the question becomes not whether the books all say exactly the same thing, but whether they bear witness to the same Jesus and to the same one true God and his wisdom. So they said, if you look at the New Testament, it is unified. It picks up the story narrated in the Hebrew Scriptures. Right? It's got the story about God creating humans, and people turn away, and then you get judgment, and it ruined all of creation, but God is going to bless the world through the nation of Israel. I mean, this is the whole story there. God promises to raise up a king like David to rule forever. And then we come to the New Testament. What do we hear? That story is picked up, and David's future king will be Jesus. He blessed the world through his life, death, and resurrection. So the New Testament's unity doesn't mean you tell the same story identically. It weaves together different scenes and different events and even different genres, meaning different ways to write. And it presents Jesus' first and second coming and the implications of him being in this world. And the early church, they say, viewed that diversity as an advantage, not a liability. I mean, for example, did they get rid of 4 Gospels and just keep one, just to be an exclusive witness? No. The early church knew that having 4 sources are better than one. They give a richer picture of Jesus, don't they? So they said, yes, there is legitimate diversity in the New Testament, but does diversity mean disagreement? And they say no. All right, so here's claim number 1. The New Testament authors have contradictory points of views on major issues, right? That's one of the things Bart Ehrman has said. Oh, it's a contradictory perspective on different issues. So they've mentioned Craig Blomberg, who says, in the midst of scriptural unity, so don't lose sight of its diversity. I mean, you've got different authors writing. They wrote in different times. They wrote in different places. They had different audiences in mind, and they used different literary genres, like letters, for example, and biographies and things like that. So each book has distinct, unique purposes and themes. So you can tell there's a huge difference between Ehrman and Blomberg there. So Blomberg sees the New Testament documents as, yes, they express different yet compatible theologies. But Ehrman just doesn't see anything that unifies them, and he sees any difference as a contradiction. So we recognize the New Testament, they said, the unity in it, but they said that doesn't preclude the realization that the biblical authors were real people who had their own particular points of view and things that they wanted to emphasize. So here are a couple of test cases. Let's get specific, they say. Let's take a look at cases that talk about these contradictions that Ehrman brings up. So how about this one? Ehrman mentions that Mark and Luke have different depictions of the crucifixion. In Mark, Jesus dies in despair. He doesn't seem to know what's going on. In Luke, Jesus is in complete control. So many scholars say, yes, that there seem to be different perspectives on Jesus' life and also his death. So is that fair? Can 2 authors highlight different aspects of Jesus' death? Does that make them incompatible? Well, first of all, they say the gospel writers never claim to give an exhaustive account of everything that happened on the cross. I mean, each evangelist was free, right? Free will. They could pick and choose from the various details of that day. Mark indicates Jesus let out a second cry. Yes, he did say, my God, why have you forsaken me? But he cried out something else. The 4 canonical Gospels provide other details and other utterances. So it's reasonable to assume that Jesus experienced diverse emotions as he died on the cross. Oh, for heaven's sakes, he's human, of course. Ehrman claims that Jesus, in the book of Mark, dies in agony. He's not even sure of the reason for his death. Oh, well, but earlier in Mark, Jesus had told his disciples why he had to die. Mark 10. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. There are 3 related accounts in Mark where Jesus does predict his death. Mark 8, 9, and 10. So even while facing the agony of what he was going to suffer, Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane says, my betrayer is near, let's go. It doesn't sound like a man who's lost control. And in Mark 14, Jesus is in front of the high priest. He provides the testimony that led to his crucifixion. So it's true, Luke does highlight Jesus' confidence in the face of suffering, but it's not absent in Mark. Here's another test case that Ehrman wants to go with. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke mention Jesus' virgin birth, but it seems like Mark and John are unaware of it. I mean, after all, Matthew and Luke are the only ones that affirm the virgin birth. But did that mean the other 2 Gospels denied it or were unaware of it? Mark and John just didn't include it. And any historical account by any nature is selective. So why would you go after the Gospels? Because they put some things in and left other things out. Why do you have 4 Gospels? To have 4 different perspectives. Mark doesn't just skip over the virgin birth, by the way. He skips over the first 30 years of Jesus' life. And they claim it's really illegitimate to contend that just because Mark doesn't mention it, that he didn't know about the virgin birth. So I think that's a good point. What about John? Well, when he opens his gospel, wow, he does much more than the virgin birth. It's even grander, right? It's Jesus pre-existing in glory with God the Father. Some people have even detected indirect references to the virgin birth in John's gospel. How about John 1:13? He speaks of those who were born not of blood, or of the will of the flesh, or of the will of man, but of God. That might be a hint to the virgin birth. How about we weren't born of sexual immorality? We have one God Father. That's John 8. Says maybe there's something going on there. When it says the Jews weren't born of sexual immorality, Jesus was. That was the rumor going around at the time. Here's a test case number 3. In other words, here's another challenge. Well, in Matthew, Jesus refuses to perform a miracle to prove his deity, but in John, over and over again, we get these spectacular deeds. They're not called miracles, they're called signs, and they're used to convince people of his true identity. But if you look more closely, they say the Gospels, they contain both positive and negative remarks concerning Jesus' miracles. So, for example, take the case of John doing those signs. He may have picked up on the only event identified as a sign in relation to Jesus in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That's the sign of Jonah. So John, probably writing later, apparently sought to make a theological point about not the display of Jesus' power in and of itself. I mean, what if people saw or even were the beneficiaries of one of Jesus' miracles, but suppose they didn't perceive that the miracles pointed to what Jesus was? So John, rightly, I think, was looking at Jesus' miracles not just to wow people, not just to go, oh, wow. It was to induce them into faith in the Messiah. So John chooses to call these miracles in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he calls them signs, to make it clear that what really mattered was how those miracles were points, right? They were pointing. They were like signposts to recognize Jesus as the Messiah and Son of God. All right, here's another test case, number 4. Matthew and Paul, a contradiction on salvation and the law. Well, what does Romans 3:21 say? Well, for Paul, salvation comes only by believing in the death and resurrection of Jesus, not following the requirements of the law. But Ehrman says, well, Paul's theology disagrees with Matthew. So if you look at Matthew 5, Ehrman says in Matthew, the whole law has to be kept. It's intact. And here's what Ehrman says. If Matthew, who wrote some 25 or 30 years after Paul, ever read any of Paul's letters. He didn't find them inspiring. Matthew has a different view of the law. He thinks that they, as followers of Jesus, need to keep the law. They've got to keep it better even than most religious Jews. So for Ehrman in Matthew to be great, that's Matthew 5:19, you got to keep the least of the commandments. And if you want to get into the kingdom, you better keep the law better than the Pharisees. But that's not what Paul says. So they admit that Ehrman's bringing up issues that are pretty involved. And they said scholars have differed in how to understand the relationship between law and gospel. But they say, contrary to what Ehrman is pushing, Matthew and Paul's theology are pretty close, and it testifies to the unity of the writings in the New Testament. So first, most Pauline scholars have noted that in Paul as well, it's important for Christians to keep the law. Now, in the world of New Testament scholarship, there have been debates over what that really means. Right? What does it mean to keep the law? So there's wide consensus, though, that Paul views good works as a part of the Christian life. It's not a saving work, but it's a demonstration that you're a Christian. They also say, if you read real closely Matthew 5:17-20, you see that Jesus' teaching, according to Matthew, looks a lot like Paul's understanding of the law. So law in Matthew 5:18 is not just a reference to the Mosaic law. It refers to the Old Testament scriptures in their entirety. So Matthew 5:19 can be understood as a call to teach and submit to the law, but the law is not going to be obeyed and taught in its old manifestation of the Old Testament, but through Christ's fulfillment of the law. Jesus calls for a fulfillment of the law by looking to the internal aspects of it, how you feel about things in your heart. We've got a Pauline passage in Romans 10 that says, for Christ is the end of the law for righteousness, which I think is a really good point. So end could be referencing Christ as being the termination of the law, or maybe he's the goal of the law, or culmination. I think that works real well. So Paul is saying that the Mosaic law that started so long ago has reached its goal, and then it doesn't really play the same central role that it had before Jesus came, although it's still relevant as you see it through Christ. So both Matthew 5 and Romans 10 show Christ as the culmination of the Old Testament law. They're not really disagreeing. They said also, if you look at Matthew, there are indications that, works are important, but individuals aren't meant to count on them and count on the law to make them right with God. I mean, you think about Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. People felt pretty convicted, right? Those high standards. And it ends with a call to pray to God for his favor. So there's a progression that's going on from Jesus to Paul. Right? Jesus is preaching to people before they've witnessed his death and resurrection. And so it's a little different view of things there. How about another claim? Maybe we'll just do a couple more here. Attempts to reconcile various events in the New Testament are mistaken. Right? You create another account trying to harmonize them. That's different than the ones being read. So Ehrman is saying it's illegitimate to even try to reconstruct from the Gospels some unified account. You can't do it. Harmonization doesn't work. And these three authors agree it could be messy. So, for example, Matthew 12, Mark 2, and Luke 5 all have a story. Jesus and his disciples are walking through a grain field on the Sabbath day, and they're picking off grains, heads of the grains as they're eating. They're hungry. And some of the Pharisees see that. Now they're being accused of breaking the law. So Jesus responds, and he recalls a 1,000-year-old scene from King David's early life. When they were hungry, David and his men were hungry, and they ended up eating sacred loaves dedicated for the worship of God. The priest gave them those consecrated loaves anyway. The priest's name, according to 1 Samuel 21, was Ahimelech. Now, Mark is the only one of the gospel writers who says, who when they recount the event, they tell the old story, says it occurred when there's a high priest named Abiathar. So now, which is it, Ahimelech or Abiathar? So it said that sent Bart Ehrman over the edge, said God can't keep his high priest straight. And it says, it's possible these two names got confused. Said anybody could see that. But there's some reasonable explanation for that. Well, for example, the Greek word epi, used in Mark 2, right before Abiathar, the high priest, is normally translated upon. But that doesn't really make sense. So maybe epi was being used to talk about the time the event took place. So when people talk about the climate of American culture, they'll talk about the Eisenhower administration. Well, what they mean really is the 1950s. Well, Eisenhower didn't come in until 1953. So Abiathar, who is a much more recognizable high priestly name, says it might have been the quickest connection for Mark's people to recognize. Okay, so maybe it was indicating location, for example. So the passage from 1 Samuel that Mark is talking about falls right before the first scenes involving Abiathar. So it wouldn't be unusual for him to use that name as a kind of a title for a section of the scripture to which he's referring. Okay, then we get one more example. Ehrman takes the account of Jesus' trial in front of Pontius Pilate, and he says, contradiction between Mark and John. Mark's account is short and straightforward. Jesus doesn't say much. Pilate doesn't declare him innocent. But John's account is a lot longer. Jesus has a lot more to say. Pilate declares, I don't find any guilt in this man. Now, these three authors that wrote this book, Truth in a Culture of Doubt, say, yeah, there are some differences, but why Ehrman thinks those are discrepancies, he said, is hard to understand. What you're getting is different perspectives. I think that's the key to this whole section. It's different perspectives by different authors looking at the same event. John has some details that you don't find in Mark, but they don't contradict. They said you see that all the time with secular historians, so not a problem there. Well, this is a long chapter, and there's so much good stuff. I think what I'm going to do is end at this point, because I try to keep these podcasts somewhere between 18 to 22 minutes. And my reasoning is, if you're traveling and you're just around town, you're probably going to get where you want to in 15 or 20 minutes. So I'm hoping this becomes, something that you got a definite beginning and a definite end to. Also, maybe if you're around the house, you got a few minutes, you're doing dishes or something. I'm thinking 20 minutes or so is probably a good amount of time to give to this. So that's why I'm doing it the way I'm doing it. So we'll come back to this, but I wanted to get back to some of these challenges that Bart Ehrman and others have made regarding the New Testament. I think Ehrman is working hard to get people to, I guess, what's the word there? They're going to believe everything that he's saying without really doing the hard work themselves of looking. So I know some of the stuff we were talking about is kind of difficult to comprehend when you're just out in the yard working or walking in the neighborhood or something. But the point is, there are plenty of ways to put these pieces together and not see them as contradictions at all. All right, well, thanks for being part of this podcast, and hope your day is going well.